Chicago, just after dawn. The city is quiet in a way it rarely is. Lake Michigan lies flat and grey. Smoke from the stockyards has not yet begun to thicken the air. In the northern districts, behind stone facades and manicured hedges, the houses are still. Inside one of them, wealth is already at work. Not money moving hand to hand, not wages or prices or trade, but capital at rest, accumulated, inherited, and waiting. By the early 20th century, the McCormick fortune had become something close to geological. It was not earned year by year, but layered, generation over generation, compacted by patents, machines, rail contracts, and global grain markets. Its scale was no longer visible in factories alone. It lived in trusts, boards, land titles, and endowments. It did not need its owners to act quickly. Time worked for it. Anita McCormick Blaine was born into that stillness. She did not invent. She did not manufacture. She did not command labor or manage production. And, yet, within her lifetime, her money would finance some of the most aggressive reform movements of the American progressive era. Labor protections, education experiments, civil liberties campaigns, ideological battles that split universities, unions, and legislatures, conflicts that reshaped institutions long after her name faded from public memory. This influence was never direct. It did not announce itself. It did not wear authority. It moved through committees, through anonymous donations, through foundations whose names outlived their founders' intentions, through reformers who spoke publicly while others quietly paid the bills. There is no single moment when this power is declared. No speech, no signature act, no dramatic confrontation. Only a slow, steady conversion of inherited industrial wealth into social pressure. Pressure applied to courts, schools, labor systems, and public opinion. Anita McCormick Blaine's story is not about ambition in the usual sense. It is about what happens when private capital enters public conflict, believing it can guide outcomes, and discovers too late that money, once released into movements, does not return unchanged. To understand how this happened, it is necessary to go back, not to her childhood, but to the systems that made her existence and her influence possible at all. Long before Anita McCormick Blaine inherited power, that power had already begun to outgrow the people who created it. The McCormick fortune did not emerge suddenly. It accumulated through a series of technical decisions, legal advantages, and historical timing that by the late 19th century had locked American agriculture into a new industrial rhythm. At its center stood a machine, not glamorous, not symbolic, but transformative in scale, the mechanical reaper. In 1831, Cyrus Hall McCormick demonstrated an early version of the reaper in rural Virginia. By mid-century, the device had shifted from experiment to infrastructure. It reduced harvest labor by orders of magnitude, compressing weeks of human effort into days. As the United States expanded westward, the machine followed. Wheat fields in Illinois, Iowa, and Kansas were no longer limited by manpower. Grain production surged, prices stabilized, markets widened. But the reaper's significance was not only agricultural. It created one of the earliest examples of modern industrial capitalism applied to farming. Standardized manufacturing, patent enforcement, centralized distribution, and vertical integration. By the 1840s and 1850s, McCormick Reapers were being produced in volume. After the Civil War, production shifted decisively to Chicago. In 1847, the McCormick Works was established on the city's north side, positioned deliberately along rail lines and waterways. Chicago, already a grain hub, became the logistical heart of mechanized agriculture. The numbers grew faster than the city could track them. By the 1870s, tens of thousands of machines were sold annually. By the 1880s, the company employed thousands of workers. Grain harvested with McCormick equipment fed not only the United States, but export markets across Europe. Wealth followed infrastructure. Profits were reinvested aggressively. The company expanded its product lines. It purchased competitors. It enforced patents in court. By the time Cyrus McCormick died in 1884, the business had moved beyond the personality of its founder. It had become a system, one capable of sustaining wealth independent of individual management. That system hardened after his death. Control passed to heirs and trustees, who professionalized the operation further. The McCormick Harvesting Machine Company became part of a broader industrial network: banks, railroads, steel suppliers, and international distributors. In 1902, it merged with several rivals to form International Harvester, one of the largest manufacturing corporations in the world. This merger mattered. International Harvester consolidated capital on a scale that few families could meaningfully oversee alone. Ownership became abstracted through shares and trusts. The McCormicks retained enormous influence, but the money now moved through corporate governance structures rather than factory floors. By the turn of the century, the family's wealth no longer required entrepreneurial risk. It generated returns through dividends, land holdings, and financial instruments. Income arrived without visible labor. Decision-making shifted from production to allocation. This is the environment into which Anita McCormick Blaine was born in 1866, a world where capital had already separated from its origins, where wealth no longer needed to justify itself through creation, and where the most consequential choices were not how to make money, but what to do with it. Chicago, meanwhile, was changing in parallel. The same machinery that generated McCormick profits displaced agricultural labor and accelerated urban migration. Former farmhands and immigrant workers poured into industrial cities. Factories expanded faster than housing. Wages lagged behind productivity. Labor unrest became structural rather than episodic. By the 1880s and 1890s, Chicago was a city of extremes: immense fortunes alongside grinding poverty, monumental architecture rising above overcrowded tenements. The Haymarket Affair of 1886 had already revealed how volatile the balance between labor and capital had become. Strikes, lockouts, and private security forces were no longer exceptional. They were expected. The McCormick name was not peripheral to these tensions. McCormick factories were sites of labor conflict. Wage disputes, strike-breaking, and clashes with workers placed the family's wealth squarely within the moral debates of the era. Industrial capitalism had produced abundance, but it had also produced instability, resentment, and organized resistance. By the time Anita McCormick reached adulthood, the question facing elite families like hers was no longer whether reform was necessary, but who would control it. Reform required funding. Funding required fortunes. And fortunes, once inherited, required justification. That justification would soon take institutional form, shaped by gender, class, and the carefully constructed pathways through which elite women were permitted to act. And it is there, in those pathways, that Anita McCormick Blaine's influence begins to come into view. By the end of the 19th century, reform in the United States had become organized. It no longer depended solely on spontaneous protest or isolated moral campaigns. Instead, it operated through clubs, boards, commissions, settlement houses, universities, and foundations. A dense institutional web designed to translate concern into policy pressure. This infrastructure did not emerge naturally. It required space, legitimacy, and above all, sustained funding. For elite women, this system offered both opportunity and constraint. Formal political power remained largely inaccessible. Women could not vote in federal elections. They could not hold most offices. They were excluded from corporate governance and labor leadership. Yet wealth created exceptions. Through philanthropy, elite women were permitted, even encouraged, to shape public life, so long as they did so indirectly. This was not accidental. It was structural. Philanthropy functioned as a socially acceptable channel for influence. It allowed private capital to engage public problems without challenging existing hierarchies overtly. Donors did not issue commands. They funded experiments. They supported research. They underwrote educational initiatives. Language softened power, but the effects were real. Anita McCormick was educated for this world. Born in 1866, she came of age during a period when elite education for women was expanding but carefully bounded. She attended schools that emphasized moral responsibility, social awareness, and administrative competence, preparing women not for governance, but for stewardship. The assumption was clear. Wealth carried obligation, and obligation could be discharged through guided benevolence. Chicago offered a unique laboratory for this model. The city had grown too quickly for its institutions to keep pace. Public schools were overcrowded. Labor conditions were unstable. Immigration overwhelmed existing welfare systems. Reformers argued that targeted intervention, scientific, data-driven, professionally managed, could stabilize society without dismantling capitalism itself. Settlement houses like Hull House, founded in 1889, became central nodes in this network. Universities expanded social science departments to study poverty, labor, and education. Legal advocacy groups formed to test labor laws and civil liberties in court. Each required consistent funding. Money did not merely support these efforts, it structured them. Boards determined priorities. Endowments imposed continuity. Donors selected which reforms were reasonable and which were not. Radical ideas without patrons remained marginal. Moderate reforms with funding gained permanence. Anita McCormick Blaine entered reform life through these channels, not as a public leader, but as a financier with access to decision-making spaces closed to most activists. She sat on boards. She endowed programs. She financed research. Her presence was often quiet, but her financial commitments were not. Marriage further positioned her within elite networks. In 1891, she married Emmons Blaine, son of James G. Blaine, a former U.S. Secretary of State and presidential candidate. The union linked industrial wealth to national political lineage. Though Emmons Blaine struggled with health issues and died in 1892, the marriage placed Anita within East Coast political and intellectual circles, as well as Chicago's industrial elite. Widowed at 26, she retained control over substantial resources. Social norms that might have constrained a married woman's autonomy now loosened. She did not remarry. Her financial independence became permanent. This mattered. Without a husband managing her estate, Anita McCormick Blaine could allocate funds according to her own priorities. Yet those priorities were shaped by the reform culture around her. A culture that believed social problems could be managed through expertise, institutions, and sustained funding rather than mass political upheaval. By the 1900s, reform had become professionalized. Social workers were trained. Economists produced studies. Legal scholars drafted model legislation. Universities became incubators for policy ideas. Foundations became intermediaries between wealth and action. Anita McCormick Blaine's role was to enable this machinery. She funded educational experiments, including progressive schooling models that challenged rote instruction and rigid discipline. She supported labor research and legal advocacy aimed at improving working conditions without endorsing outright class conflict. She financed civil liberties organizations that defended free speech and due process, often in politically volatile contexts. Each decision appeared discreet. Each donation seemed targeted. But taken together, they formed a pattern: inherited industrial wealth being converted into reform pressure, not against capitalism itself, but against its excesses. This positioning placed her in an uneasy middle ground. To industrialists, reformers funded by McCormick money appeared disloyal, even subversive. To radicals, elite philanthropy looked like an attempt to control change rather than empower it. Anita McCormick Blaine occupied a narrow corridor between these forces, believing institutions could be shaped without being captured. That belief would soon be tested. Because reform, once funded, develops momentum. Organizations grow. Staff professionalize. Ideologies sharpen. And money, no matter how carefully given, begins to travel beyond its original intent. The next step is to examine how this influence functioned in practice, not as biography, but as power expressed through wealth, structures, and hierarchy. Power, in Anita McCormick Blaine's world, did not announce itself. It did not issue orders or appear in headlines. It accumulated through access to boards, to trusteeships, to advisory committees, spaces where agendas were set long before public debate began. This was not accidental. Progressive era reform relied on pre-public consensus. By the time ideas reached legislatures or courts, they had already been filtered, softened, and framed as inevitable. Anita McCormick Blaine's power operated at this preliminary stage. She financed organizations early when they were fragile and directionless. Early funding conferred influence, not through explicit conditions, but through trust and dependence. Institutions remember their first patrons. They adapt their language, priorities, and leadership to keep those patrons engaged. Her wealth made this possible. By the early 20th century, McCormick family income derived primarily from dividends, land rents, and investment returns. This income was stable, recurring, and largely insulated from short-term market shocks. Unlike self-made donors who might withdraw support during downturns, Anita's giving could be sustained across decades. This mattered for reform organizations attempting long-term change. Legal advocacy groups required years to bring test cases through the courts. Educational reforms needed generations of students to demonstrate results. Labor research depended on continuous data collection and publication. Short-term donations were insufficient. Endowments created permanence. Anita McCormick Blaine provided exactly that. She funded chairs, institutes, and experimental schools rather than single projects. These structures outlived their founders. They trained professionals who carried reform principles into government, academia, and civil society. Influence diffused outward, becoming harder to trace back to its financial source. Wealth also provided insulation. Because her fortune was inherited rather than earned, she did not need to defend it publicly. She was not seeking political office. She did not rely on popularity. This allowed her to support controversial causes without immediate personal consequence. One of the most significant areas she funded was education. At a time when American schooling emphasized discipline, standardization, and vocational preparation, progressive educators argued for child-centered learning, critical thinking, and social awareness. These ideas challenged existing school systems and teacher training institutions. They required protected environments to develop. Anita McCormick Blaine helped create those environments. Through funding experimental schools and university-affiliated education programs, she allowed alternative pedagogies to operate outside immediate political pressure. These institutions functioned as testing grounds. Successful methods were later absorbed into public systems. Unsuccessful ones quietly disappeared. Architecture, in this sense, was institutional rather than physical. Buildings mattered, but governance mattered more. Boards structured authority. Charters defined mission. Funding agreements determined accountability. Anita's influence was embedded here, in the frameworks that shaped how reform organizations operated. Yet this power was never absolute. Once institutions reached a certain scale, they developed their own priorities. Staff turnover introduced new ideologies. External funding diversified revenue streams. Original donors became symbolic rather than controlling figures. This was the paradox of philanthropic power. Money could launch movements, but not freeze them in place. The more successful a reform organization became, the less it depended on any single benefactor. Influence diluted even as impact expanded. Anita McCormick Blaine accepted this trade-off, perhaps without fully anticipating its consequences. Her wealth bought entry, leverage, and longevity. It did not guarantee alignment. And as her funded institutions grew more confident, they began to engage more directly with political and economic power, sometimes in ways that unsettled the very elite networks that had made their existence possible. To understand how this tension unfolded, it is necessary to look beyond power and wealth alone, toward hierarchy, politics, and the long-term economics of reform itself. Social hierarchy shaped every aspect of Anita McCormick Blaine's influence. She operated within a narrow elite stratum that valued restraint, discretion, and legitimacy above visibility. Open confrontation with political or industrial power was discouraged. Reform, in this world, was meant to be corrective, not disruptive. The goal was stabilization, reducing conflict without redistributing authority. This placed Anita in a complicated position. Her wealth originated in systems that reformers increasingly criticized. Industrial labor practices, monopolistic consolidation, and corporate governance structures all came under scrutiny during the Progressive era. Funding reform meant, indirectly, funding critique of the conditions that produced her fortune. To manage this contradiction, reform was often framed in technical terms. Labor problems became questions of efficiency and safety rather than exploitation. Education reform emphasized productivity and civic preparation. Civil liberties advocacy focused on constitutional process rather than class struggle. These frames made reform palatable to elites while still producing tangible change. Anita McCormick Blaine supported organizations that adopted this language. Her political influence, therefore, was not partisan. She did not finance campaigns or candidates directly. Instead, she funded research bodies, legal defense organizations, and educational institutions whose outputs shaped policy indirectly. Legislators cited studies. Courts referenced legal arguments. Administrators adopted best practices. This mode of influence was slower, but more durable. One of the most consequential areas she supported was civil liberties. During periods of labor unrest and wartime repression, free speech and due process were frequently curtailed. Advocacy organizations challenged these restrictions through test cases and public education. Funding such efforts was controversial, especially when defendants were radicals or labor organizers. Anita McCormick Blaine's money made these challenges possible. By underwriting legal defense and organizational infrastructure, she enabled sustained resistance to state and corporate suppression of dissent. This placed her at odds with segments of the business community, including interests adjacent to her own family's industrial legacy. Hierarchy complicated response. As an elite woman, her actions were less visible and less directly challenged than those of male reformers. Critics often targeted organizations rather than donors. This anonymity provided protection, but it also obscured accountability. When reform initiatives escalated beyond moderate bounds, the link to elite funding was not always publicly acknowledged. Economics played a decisive role in how long this system could function. Reform organizations, once established, required constant funding to maintain staff, publications, and legal work. Endowments provided stability, but they also encouraged bureaucratization. Missions expanded, administrative layers thickened, original goals sometimes blurred. This created a subtle shift. Reform became less about solving discrete problems and more about sustaining institutions. Fundraising, governance, and reputation management began to consume energy. Dependence on elite donors persisted even as rhetoric grew more radical. For donors like Anita McCormick Blaine, this posed a dilemma: withdraw funding and risk collapse or capture by more extreme interests, continue funding and accept reduced influence over direction. There was no neutral choice. Over time, her relationship with some organizations grew strained. Financial support continued, but ideological alignment weakened. Reform, once a controlled intervention, became an autonomous force. This was not a sudden rupture. It unfolded gradually through budget decisions, leadership changes, and shifting public contexts. By the late 1910s and early 1920s, the scale of reform battles over labor rights, education, and civil liberties had intensified. The stakes were higher, the language sharper, the political environment less forgiving. Anita McCormick Blaine's money was no longer simply enabling experiments. It was underwriting conflicts with national implications. And with that escalation came a turning point, one where the limits of philanthropic power and the costs of sustained reform became impossible to ignore. By the time the United States entered the First World War in April 1917, the reform landscape Anita McCormick Blaine had helped finance was no longer peripheral. It sat directly in the path of national crisis. War did not suspend domestic conflict. It intensified it. Industrial production accelerated. Labor demand increased. Wages rose unevenly. Strikes multiplied. At the same time, the federal government expanded its authority over speech, assembly, and political dissent. Laws passed in the name of national security reached deeply into civilian life. For reform organizations, this created a test. Those focused on labor conditions faced pressure to suppress strikes. Those advocating civil liberties confronted censorship, surveillance, and prosecution. Universities and schools were urged to align curricula with patriotic objectives. Anita McCormick Blaine continued to fund organizations that resisted these pressures. Her financial support helped sustain legal challenges to wartime restrictions on speech and association. It supported educational institutions that maintained progressive pedagogies rather than reverting to nationalist discipline. It underwrote research and advocacy that documented labor abuses during wartime production surges. These were no longer quiet interventions. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 criminalized dissent in broad terms. Hundreds were prosecuted. Newspapers were suppressed. Advocacy organizations defending civil liberties were labeled unpatriotic or subversive. Funding such work carried reputational risk. Elite donors withdrew. Boards fractured. Universities distanced themselves from controversial programs. The reform infrastructure narrowed, leaving fewer patrons willing to absorb public criticism. Anita McCormick Blaine did not withdraw. Her wealth, shielded by trusts and inheritance, allowed her to continue funding without immediate financial retaliation. But the social cost increased. Her name became associated, quietly but persistently, with causes viewed as destabilizing during wartime. After the war, the pressure did not abate. The post-war years brought economic volatility. Demobilization disrupted labor markets. The Russian Revolution of 1917 fueled fear of radicalism. The Red Scare of 1919 to 1920 targeted labor organizers, socialists, and anarchists. Reform organizations Anita McCormick Blaine had supported now found themselves under investigation. Offices were raided, records seized, staff arrested or deported. Funding streams were scrutinized. Associations with elite donors were used rhetorically to frame reform as conspiratorial or elitist. Again, her money kept institutions alive. Legal defense funds were replenished. Publications resumed after shutdowns. Educational programs restructured rather than closed. But survival came at a cost. Organizations hardened ideologically. Under attack, moderate reformers lost ground to more uncompromising voices. Defensive postures became permanent. Collaboration with government agencies diminished. Reform shifted from advisory to adversarial. For Anita McCormick Blaine, this marked a transition. Her philanthropy was no longer shaping reform gently, it was sustaining resistance. This altered the meaning of her support, from stewardship to sponsorship of conflict. Financial figures reflected this shift. Annual donations increased. Endowments were expanded to protect organizations from sudden withdrawal of external funding. The scale of her giving, while still private, reached levels that made her one of the most significant backers of civil liberties and progressive education in the country. Yet control continued to erode. Boards she once influenced became more autonomous. Leadership increasingly came from professional activists rather than elite intermediaries. Decisions were made in response to political crises rather than donor preferences. The momentum of reform had exceeded its original design. This was not a dramatic break. There was no public resignation or denunciation, only a growing realization that once capital commits to sustained ideological struggle, it cannot easily disengage without consequence. The second phase of this turning point would force that reality into sharper focus through financial strain, institutional drift, and the quiet recalibration of influence. By the early 1920s, the reform institutions Anita McCormick Blaine had helped build no longer needed her in the way they once had. They still relied on money. They no longer relied on permission. The post-war period brought a structural change in American philanthropy. Large foundations, professionally managed, publicly visible, and increasingly bureaucratic, began to dominate the funding landscape. Government agencies expanded their role in education, labor regulation, and civil liberties. Universities formalized reform agendas within academic departments rather than donor-led initiatives. This altered the balance of power. Organizations once dependent on individual patrons diversified their funding. Small donations, membership dues, foundation grants, and public contracts reduced reliance on elite benefactors. Autonomy increased. Accountability shifted inward, toward boards and professional leadership. For Anita McCormick Blaine, this meant influence receded even as impact expanded. Institutions she had financed became fixtures of American public life. Their missions hardened into doctrine. Their language sharpened. Their leaders spoke with authority derived not from donors, but from precedent and scale. Financial commitment remained high. She continued to endow programs, fund legal challenges, and support educational initiatives through the 1920s. But these acts increasingly resembled maintenance rather than direction. Money preserved infrastructure. It no longer set trajectory. This shift was most evident in civil liberties work. Organizations that began as defensive legal advocates grew into permanent watchdogs. They challenged not only wartime excesses, but peacetime governance, policing, and corporate influence. Their scope widened beyond what many elite reformers had originally imagined. Public backlash followed. Politicians accused reform institutions of undermining social order. Business leaders criticized them as hostile to enterprise. Universities distanced themselves from controversial affiliations. Funding became politicized. Anita McCormick Blaine absorbed these pressures privately. There is little evidence of public protest or withdrawal. Instead, records suggest a gradual reassessment, not of principles, but of expectations. Reform had not failed. It had succeeded in a form that could no longer be managed by its original sponsors. Financial strain compounded this realization. While her wealth remained substantial, the economic environment of the late 1920s introduced uncertainty. Markets fluctuated. Endowment returns varied. Long-term commitments required careful management. Philanthropy became less flexible. Then came October 1929. The stock market crash did not erase the McCormick fortune, but it exposed the vulnerability of even inherited wealth to systemic shock. Asset values fell. Income streams tightened. Institutional commitments made during more optimistic years now required recalibration. Support continued, but at reduced elasticity. Organizations faced difficult choices: cut programs, seek alternative funding, or adapt missions to attract new patrons. In navigating these pressures, many moved further from their original philanthropic origins. Anita McCormick Blaine's death in 1934 formalized what had already occurred. Control passed to executors. Endowments followed legal mandates rather than personal judgment. Institutions continued operating under names that rarely referenced her role. Reform became part of the national fabric, detached from its private sources. This was not defeat. It was a transformation. Her money had done what it could do: launch, sustain, and protect reform long enough for it to become self-sustaining. What it could not do was remain central once the structures matured. The final question was not whether her influence endured, but how it was absorbed, reallocated, and remembered, or forgotten, in the decades that followed. After Anita McCormick Blaine's death in 1934, there was no rupture, no collapse of institutions, no sudden reckoning, no public accounting of influence lost. The organizations she had funded continued almost unchanged. Their offices remained open. Their boards met as scheduled. Their legal work, educational programs, and research publications proceeded under new fiscal assumptions. This continuity was itself the result of decades of endowment building and structural planning. Her absence was administrative, not existential. Control moved quietly into legal frameworks. Trust documents dictated disbursements. Executors enforced intent through clauses rather than conversation. Where discretion had once existed, compliance now governed. This shift favored institutions. Organizations accustomed to donor negotiation now operated under fixed funding rules. They adapted easily. In some cases, restrictions embedded in endowments proved less limiting than personal oversight had been. Money arrived without commentary. Leadership consolidated authority. Professional administrators, trained in fundraising and governance, became the primary decision-makers. Boards drew increasingly from academic, legal, and non-profit management backgrounds rather than industrial elites. The social composition of reform leadership shifted. This mattered. Reform, once mediated by elite sensibilities, became more internally coherent and more ideologically insulated. The need to reassure wealthy patrons diminished. Accountability flowed upward within institutions rather than outward to donors. In education, progressive models pioneered with private funding entered public systems selectively. Teacher training programs absorbed pedagogical principles while discarding experimental excesses. The influence remained, though its origins blurred. In civil liberties, legal precedents established during earlier conflicts became foundational. Courts cited past rulings without reference to the private funding that enabled those cases to be argued in the first place. Advocacy became normalized. In labor reform, research institutions fed data into New Deal-era policymaking. Studies once considered controversial informed federal standards on wages, hours, and workplace safety. Reform, having survived repression, now aligned with state power. Anita McCormick Blaine's role in these developments was rarely acknowledged. This was not deliberate erasure, it was structural. Philanthropy, by design, effaces itself over time. Institutions' foreground mission, not benefactors. As years pass, founders recede into archival footnotes. What remains is function. There were exceptions. Within elite circles, her name persisted as a reference point, an example of sustained, principled giving. Within certain organizations, internal histories noted her early support, but public memory did not attach reform outcomes to her identity. The reasons were practical. She had avoided publicity in life. She had not sought credit. Her influence had been exercised through financial channels rather than charismatic leadership. As a result, there was little narrative to preserve. What survived was structure. The system she helped finance no longer required elite industrial wealth to operate. It drew on public funding, professional legitimacy, and cultural acceptance. Reform had been institutionalized. This outcome would have been unimaginable in the 1890s. It represented a shift in how power moved, from individual patrons to permanent organizations, from private wealth to public norms. Anita McCormick Blaine's fortune had served as a bridge between those worlds. The final step is to understand what this absorption meant in the long run, for reform, for elite influence, and for the kind of power that leaves no monument. By the mid-20th century, the systems Anita McCormick Blaine had helped sustain no longer resembled the fragile reform experiments they once were. They had budgets. They had staff hierarchies. They had institutional memory. And they had histories that did not center on donors. This was the final stage of the process her philanthropy had set in motion. Not collapse, not victory, but normalization. Civil liberties organizations became permanent fixtures of American legal life. Their early struggles against wartime repression faded into precedent. Their founders became names in internal documents. Their financial origins were no longer relevant to their authority. Progressive education principles filtered unevenly into public schools and universities. Some ideas were adopted, others abandoned. What remained was a quiet reshaping of curricula, teacher training, and child development theory. No plaque recorded whose money had protected these experiments during their most vulnerable years. Labor reform followed a similar pattern. Research institutions funded during periods of private sponsorship supplied intellectual infrastructure for federal labor policy during the New Deal. Once absorbed into state function, their private origins became immaterial. Reform was no longer oppositional, it was administrative. In this environment, elite, philanthropic influence receded, not because it was rejected, but because it was no longer necessary. The state, the academy, and professionalized non-profits had taken over the work. Funding sources diversified, accountability shifted. This was a success on institutional terms. It was also the quiet erasure of individual agency. Anita McCormick Blaine left no singular legacy institution bearing her name. No flagship foundation defined her public image. Her giving was distributed, layered, and deliberately understated. This made it effective and forgettable. Her personal papers, where preserved, record concern with outcomes rather than recognition. There is no evidence of frustration at fading visibility. The disappearance appears to have been anticipated, even accepted. This reflects the worldview of her class. Elite women of her era were trained to act without attribution. Influence was to be exercised responsibly, not advertised. Permanence mattered more than credit. Stability mattered more than narrative. Yet this restraint had consequences. Without a visible figure to anchor the story, later generations interpreted reform as inevitable, as a natural evolution of democratic society rather than the product of contested, privately financed struggle. The role of industrial wealth in shaping reform disappeared from public consciousness. Power became abstract. Institutions spoke in the language of neutrality. Policy debates cited expertise rather than patronage. The moral tension between inherited wealth and reform ambition dissolved into process. This was the final transformation of the McCormick fortunes reform phase. Capital that once bore a family name became infrastructure. Influence that once required careful navigation of hierarchy became procedural. The personal risk assumed by an individual benefactor vanished into collective legitimacy. By the time Anita McCormick Blaine's generation passed from living memory, her role survived only in fragments, board minutes, donor lists, institutional archives. What remained was the world her money had helped shape, and that world no longer needed to remember her. Closure. Anita McCormick Blaine never stood at the center of power. She did not command industries. She did not hold office. She did not speak for movements in public. And yet, she occupied one of the most consequential positions available in her time, the point where inherited wealth could be converted into lasting institutional force. Her life illustrates a particular moment in American history, when private capital still moved more quickly than the state, and when reform depended on patrons willing to fund conflict before legitimacy arrived. In that narrow window, individuals like Anita McCormick Blaine mattered enormously. They provided time for ideas to develop, for cases to be argued, for institutions to survive pressure long enough to become permanent. But her story also reveals the limits of that power. Money can initiate, it can protect, it can sustain. It cannot permanently direct outcomes once structures grow beyond it. The reform institutions she funded did not remain expressions of her will. They evolved, adapted, and absorbed authority from other sources. In doing so, they fulfilled the logic of reform itself, to move from private intervention to public norm. This transition came at a cost. As reform became institutionalized, the role of elite wealth faded from view. The conflicts that required private sponsorship were remembered only as legal precedents or policy milestones. The moral tension between industrial fortune and social conscience dissolved into administrative history. Anita McCormick Blaine's legacy, therefore, is not a monument or an organization that bears her name. It is a pattern in which wealth, once detached from production, seeks legitimacy through reform. A pattern in which influence is exercised quietly through systems rather than speeches. A pattern in which success ensures invisibility. Her story challenges simple narratives about power. It suggests that some of the most durable changes are financed by people who do not appear in textbooks, that institutions often remember outcomes while forgetting origins, and that ambition, when expressed through restraint, can shape history without ever claiming it. In the end, Anita McCormick Blaine did not lose control of her influence. She released it. And in doing so, she demonstrated a form of power that is rarely acknowledged, one that accepts disappearance as the price of permanence.